This is my other let's not meet situation, which occurred when my son was 4 years old. This time, I am 100% sure my kid prevented something horrible from happening to me. It turned into an episode of Law and Order with a terrifying ending. By way of background, I live in Milwaukee, which has the honor of being the most racially segregated city in the country. It's a cool city overall, but we have a really shitty inner city with tons of poverty and violence and gang activity. At the time this happened, I was living in a sort of in-between area. Not the ghetto, but not a super nice area either. I was a 22-year-old single mom. I lived on the ground floor apartment on one of the main streets. I parked in the back alley behind the building. My front door faced the street, and I had a side door too, with a walkway running between my building and the next door. Anyway, I got home in the middle of the afternoon on a Saturday with my kid. As we drove down the alley to get to my parking spot, I saw a guy with a hoodie sort of lurking around my parking spot. It was weird because it was warm outside and he had his hood up, but there were a bunch of gangster wannabe kids in the neighborhood, so whatever. It was definitely an odd place to just be standing though. As I got close to the building and started pulling into my parking spot, he turned around and started walking towards the street past my side door. He definitely left because I arrived. I figured he was just smoking a blunt or something. I didn't think anything of it, and I got my son and some bags out of the car. I went the same way the guy had just taken, to my side door. I didn't see him at all. My son and I went inside, and I was in the process of putting my stuff down when my doorbell rang. I wasn't expecting anyone, and immediately thought it was the guy. Being young and naive, I answered the front door. It was the same guy, still with his hoodie up. He immediately smiled at me, but not in a super friendly way, more of a leer. He looked like he was about 16, cornrows with a fake gold grill that was studded with little fake diamonds. I regretted opening the door, but here I was. "Hi." He kept staring at me and said nothing. At this point, I saw another kid in a hoodie pacing behind him on the sidewalk and looking at us. I was quickly realizing that this was not a good situation. My son, who I momentarily forgot about, came up behind me. He did the shy kid thing, where he stood behind me and poked his head out from behind my butt to look at the guy. Hoodie dude looks at him for a good couple of seconds, and then back at me. "Yo, is Danielle around?" "I don't know who that is. Maybe try the other door." I gestured to my neighbor's door, to my left. "You sure?" "Yeah, sorry." And he left, walking in the opposite direction of my neighbor's door. Hoodie dude number 2 followed him. I thought it was really weird that they didn't even try to check the next door for Danielle. I thought the whole thing was really weird. My boyfriend got to my apartment a few minutes later, and I was glad to see him. He had a really old Jeep that he always parked out front on the main street. When he went out to get something from his car shortly after he arrived, it was gone. Car theft was a pretty common thing in this neighborhood, but stealing it from the main street in broad daylight was pretty ballsy. So we called the cops, filed a report, the whole 9. I told the cop about the hoodie dudes, since it seemed like it could be important. I was able to give a good description of the guy who came to my door asking for Danielle. I had no idea if it was relevant, but the fact that the Jeep was stolen shortly after these guys were around seemed pretty relevant. That's where the story ended, till 2 days later. I got a call from a different cop with a downtown precinct. He told me that they had found the Jeep, and other than the ignition, it wasn't damaged. He asked me if I could come downtown to do a lineup and see if I could identify the people who had knocked on my door right before the Jeep was taken. That was weird. A lineup for a stolen car? But I agreed. He asked if I would come downtown in a couple of days. Also weird that they wouldn't want me to do it right away. But I was mostly focused on the fact that doing a lineup was pretty fucking cool. So I go downtown to the precinct a couple of days later. The way this went seemed sort of unorthodox, but it was what it was. 2 detectives took me into a dark room, while a woman in her 50s was sitting there with a young woman in a wheelchair. The young woman's lower leg was in a giant cast with this whole metal contraption surrounding it, with a dozen metal rods going into the cast itself. At this point, I had no idea what was happening. The detectives instructed us that we weren't to say anything during the lineup, except if I wanted the guys to turn around again or whatever, and we couldn't talk to each other at all. We ended up having to wait in the room for almost an hour, in the dark, awkwardly not speaking. They explained it was taking more time than anticipated to get the 12 guys from the jail over to the precinct. Finally, we got started. They did 2 lineups and gave us forms to mark 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or 6. There was a large window in front of us, and they explained that the guys couldn't see us. They turned the lights on in the room behind the window, and they brought the guys in individually. I couldn't identify anyone in the first lineup. I sort of felt bad, but I couldn't. The second lineup started, and I didn't recognize 1, 2, or 3. Number 4 came out, and I immediately recognized the dude who knocked on my door. He didn't have a stupid grill in anymore, but it was definitely the guy. After the second lineup was done, they brought the other 2 women into the hallway and told me to stay put. After a few minutes, they came back to get me. The detectives asked if I recognized anyone, and I told them I was sure about number 4 in the second lineup, but couldn't identify anyone in the first lineup. I had gathered by this point that hoodie dude number 2 had likely been in the first lineup, but I hadn't got a good look at him when he was pacing on the sidewalk. They had me sign 2 forms, one for each lineup, with a second form identifying number 4 as hoodie dude number 1. When I gave the forms back, the detectives told me that they could tell me what was actually going on now that the lineup was done. Good, because I was confused as fuck at this point. He explained that number 4 was indeed one of the guys they arrested with my boyfriend's Jeep. The guys had stolen the Jeep and driven to a nearby part of town in a quiet, lily-white neighborhood. I am also white, this is relevant. They came across a young couple unloading groceries from their car. The young woman with a leg contraption was the female half of that couple. They parked the stolen Jeep behind the couple, got out, and immediately shot them. They shot the woman in the leg and shot the young man in the dick. He was still in the hospital in bad condition, which is why he wasn't there. The older woman was the girl's mom and had brought her from the hospital to the lineup. The reason why it was delayed a couple of days was because she had emergency surgery to try to fix the damage to her leg. The guys didn't demand anything from the couple or take anything from them after the shooting. They just immediately shot them. The young woman managed to remember the license plate number of the Jeep, and they apprehended them in a corner store when a cop saw the stolen car parked outside shortly after the shooting. The shooters were both teenagers, but were being charged as adults. One of them stupidly talked before getting a lawyer and had told the detective it was a gang initiation. They had to shoot a white person. That was the price of admission. They had stolen my boyfriend's car after taking the bus out to the street I lived on. They figured it would be easier to get away if they had wheels. The detectives were pretty sure I had been the original target of opportunity, but couldn't explain why they hadn't gone through with it. Nerves, maybe? I knew why. It was because they saw my kid peeking out from behind me. They told me I might have to testify if the case went to court. A couple months later, one of the detectives called me and told me that the hoodie dudes pled out to attempted murder charges. The guy who got shot in the dick survived. I didn't ask how many years, but I assume that they're probably still in prison 13 years later. As ironic postscript to a story, my boyfriend had the same Jeep stolen from the same spot in front of my apartment about 4 months later, also in broad daylight. This time they didn't find it right away. He was staying over at my house weeks later when he got a call around 2 a.m. from the MPD arson unit. They torched it and left it in the middle of the street of a notorious violent area of the city. I moved after that. This memory of mine begins about 3 years ago. When I graduated high school, I had grown up with my grandparents, but decided to move to a different and much larger city to live with my dad for the first time in 12 years. I somewhat knew the city already because I spent summers with him, but this would be the first time I would have the freedom of an adult to come and go as I please, drive my car anywhere, smoke cigarettes whenever I wanted. I was excited, though sad to leave all my friends. As soon as I was settled in, my dad and stepmom sat me down to discuss a few rules and what I needed to know about the complex. Basic things like go wherever you want, but let us know when you leave, when you're coming back, even if it's 2 a.m. Oh, and you have to park in the street because the complex has limited parking. One more thing, there's a neighborhood creep. This guy, George, was well known to all the women in the complex, as well as the police that patrolled the area. He was tall, fairly huge, very intimidating looking. My parents were pretty certain they would leave me alone for one reason: my dad. Though George had a habit of stalking the other women in the complex, he would stop and find a new target if they had a man make a show of being in their place. A brother, a lover, or a father. It didn't matter what he was to the woman or what he looked like. George would back off immediately. Since I lived with my dad, who was also quite tall and rather big, intimidating, I also felt confident that I would be alright, and I was, for a time. It all started about 6 months after I moved in. My stepmom and dad were fighting a lot more until she got up and left him. One night, I was sitting on my porch having a cigarette and browsing Facebook or whatever. I wish I could say it felt like I was being watched, but I probably just looked up because I felt a bug or something. George was standing about 15 feet away, a little bit behind a tree, staring intensely at me. I nearly dropped my cigarette. Shakingly, I stomped it out and went inside. I was home alone, so I made sure to lock all the doors and then played a video game in my room. I told myself I was probably just paranoid. The next morning I got up for my morning cigarette and coffee. Lo and behold, 15 minutes after I got on the porch, George came out of his apartment to look my way. I sucked down my cigarette and went back inside. This pattern continued for weeks. It was like George stood at his sliding glass door peeking out, waiting to see when I would pop out. I told my dad about it, and he tried to sit with me whenever I went to smoke. If he came with me, George wouldn't even peep his head out the door. Of course, the other women in the complex have already tried to call the police about George, but he lives in the complex, and staring isn't a crime, so there isn't much they can do. I didn't know how far George had taken it with the other women before. With that info in mind, I knew calling wouldn't be much use. Things slowly escalated. Once my stepmom left, I had access to the parking spot. So I had 3 ways to get from my car to the apartment, depending on how I parked. One of the ways went just past George's apartment, about 3 feet from his door. Since I got off work late most nights, I avoided that route as much as possible. Slowly but surely, like he memorized my schedule, he would be on one of the paths when I was coming home. Not directly on the concrete, but a feet away on the grass, behind a tree. It was like he thought I couldn't see him. Picture a child hiding very terribly behind a tree. You could see 90% of their body, and you knew they were there. That's how he would do it. I would rush past him and avoid eye contact, but prepare to scream if I heard him coming after me. I started carrying my keys between my fingertips. I bought a pocket knife, and I would walk from my car with it halfway open already, even though I've never had any kind of fight in my life. Around this time, I believe my mom was trying to find me a free self-defense class, since I couldn't afford anything on my tight budget. My dad was steadily getting more and more pissed off as George edged closer and closer to escalating as the days went by. It went from November to May. If my dad wasn't home, I would lock my bedroom door and keep a knife under my pillow. I would Skype all night with my boyfriend, just so someone could call 911 for me if needed be. I put a bunch of flower pots in front of my bedroom window so no one could get in silently. I started sitting on the floor on my porch, below the wall, out of sight to smoke, but angled so I could see him if he walked up to it. Nightmares of being kidnapped or raped or murdered started to invade my sleep every night. Then, one day, my neighbor, Shell, was gossiping with me. "Did you hear about George?" "No." "He got arrested last night." In the complex parking lot, there's a big sort of electrical power box. It stands about waist height and perhaps 2 or 3 feet wide. About 10 minutes before I was supposed to come home and park right in front of it, some lady with her kid walked by and saw George sitting there on the box masturbating. Was he waiting there for me, jerking off, to the thought of me seeing him? The thought makes me want to puke and scares me all at the same time. I was relieved for a few days of my stress, but it was only a few days that he was gone. Then he came back, and he went right back to his old routine. One night he got far braver. It was maybe 7 p.m. when I went out for a cigarette with my dad. A neighbor walked up to chat with my dad, and George came outside and stood out in the open, staring me down. "Dude's asking to get his fucking ass kicked," my dad said under his breath. Then he chatted with a neighbor some more. I rolled my eyes and went inside and played some more video games. I was healing in a World of Warcraft dungeon when I heard Shell shouting, "Where are you?" But I was healing. A pretty important job, and I figured she was just talking to someone else, until she burst into my room in a panic, her eyes huge. She hopped from foot to foot frantically, like she was doing a potty dance. "He's bleeding!" "Who?" I asked in bewilderment. "Your dad! Come quick!" I made some teenage huffing sound and left my computer, certainly pissing off the rest of the group. I grabbed a little first aid kit filled with band-aids. I thought in my mind that my dad was doing something stupid, like tossing his pocket knife in the air and trying to catch it. But when I stepped outside, I found myself face to face with a real horror. About 6 people surrounded my dad, including Shell, and my neighbor Caleb held his shirt to my dad's side. He was facing away from me, and his entire back was covered with blood. It looked like he had been mauled by a bear. This was seriously my first thought. Caleb's hold on the shirt slipped, and blood sprayed. I feel queasy writing this down. I have never in my life been the person people turn to in an emergency. Blood makes me lightheaded, and I have anxiety attacks over not being able to find a specific bookmark. But all the adults around me were panicked aside from Caleb, and I needed to be the person that people could turn to. I threw the first aid kit onto the porch and told Shell where we kept the towels. She rushed inside to grab one. "Has anyone called 911? I shouted. 5 pairs of eyes turned to look at me like they never heard of 911 before. "No," my dad said. "I can't afford an ambulance." "Shut up," I said. "What happened?" "That fucker stabbed me." So I dialed 911 and relayed our address and the reason for the emergency. Operator told us to keep applying pressure to the wound on my father's lower back. My dad is a true champ. Even though the sidewalk was just one big puddle of blood, he stayed on his feet till someone thought to run and get him a chair. I ran back and forth along the walkway to get the police and show them the house that George lived in. And then I ran back and forth to get the paramedics. They were so cold and so agonizingly slow. They walked calm, and I wanted to scream at them to run. "My dad is bleeding out. Don't you care?" I learned later that it didn't run because it would let the adrenaline kick in and mistakes could happen. They shoved Caleb out of the way because he refused to let go of my dad's wound and then got him packed into the ambulance. I was about to jump on when the police stopped me and told me that I had to stay so I could give my statement. My dad shouted at me to call his boss, and I remembered all of his allergies and whatnot for the paramedics. God. 2 years later, and all these details are burned into my brain. I gave my statement to the police. Then they made me sit outside the complex on the sidewalk for 2 to 3 hours. They kept updating me on my dad. Once I called his boss, my boss, and answered all my stepmom's messages, that's when I allowed myself to break down. It felt like I cried forever. One of the cops was nice enough to go into the house and grab my cigarettes and a bottle of water for me. He stayed with me the entire time to make sure I didn't run off or something, but he was very nice. He offered to let me sit in his cruiser a few times to get away from the cold. George was waiting in his apartment when they came. When they took him out to where I was, and there were 14 cop cars, he still kept trying to stare at me. I stared right back at him and felt so much hatred that I have never in my life felt. I wanted to go over there and murder him. My babysitting cop looked over and saw that George was staring, so he used his flashlight to keep George from being able to look at me. Once it was all over, I was allowed to go back in my house where I waited for information about my dad. I gathered the story from my neighbors while he was in the hospital for 9 days. He had shouted at George to leave his daughter alone, and George shouted back at him while I was in the house totally unaware. George said something along the lines of, "Come tell me that to my face like a man." So my dad hopped over the porch and waltzed up to him. The creep had been waiting with a 12-inch blade held to the side of his leg. He struck out with his empty hand and then got my dad in the back with a knife. It missed his kidney very, very narrowly, traveled up and punctured his lung and damaged his diaphragm. My dad didn't realize he had been stabbed at first. He got George in a headlock and pummeled the shit out of him, thinking the dude had just punched him in the kidney. George dropped the knife, rolled in the grass, and picked up another knife he had been hiding and stabbed my dad again. This time it was in his upper back. This wound was much more shallow, but still required stitches later. At this point, Shell came outside and screamed to my dad that he was bleeding. He took off his shirt, got pissed, and threw it at George. At that point, the neighborhood stalker put his hands up and went back into his apartment. The blood stayed on the pavement until noon the next day, when my neighbors kindly washed it off for me. My dad spent more time in the hospital in critical condition than George spent in jail. I feel like it was kind of my fault, and I've been addressing that in therapy. Throughout the week, while I was on the porch or just outside, I had so many women come up to me. They all told me to thank my dad what they did for them. They have all been terrorized by George at some point, and now they were certain that he would be away for good. Several poor women had George stalk them up to their apartment door and pull down his pants, demanding sex. I can't believe the cops couldn't do anything. One of these days, one of my neighbors came up to me to tell me that the police and neighbors searched the complex and found that George had stashed many knives all over the place, buried in the gardens, stuck behind trees, under his doormat. I shudder to think of what he might have had planned to one day grab one of us and do something more sinister than stare. George was declared guilty for battery with a deadly weapon, but the attempted murder charge was dropped. He was out of prison by Christmas on good behavior or whatever, but my dad and I have a lifelong restraining order against him. He has never tried to come after me, so I can only hope that he's terrified of my dad. I wish I could tell you guys that I took self-defense classes and learned how to fight the way my dad can, but I'm still a pussy who can't even slap a spider, so there's that. My dad is doing alright now. He just had his third surgery on Tuesday, trying to repair the damage done to him internally. We're hoping that this will be his last, and his quality of life will vastly improve. I probably owe my life to my dad. If he hadn't fought George for me, maybe I would be the first victim George stabbed. George, let's not meet again. Hello, this is Bad Vibes. I got an update on this story from the author. It has been a couple years now. I'm 22. I've been looking to join the military. Unfortunately, we couldn't pay my father's hospital bills and his rent, and he was evicted sometime last year. I moved him up to our hometown where we have family and promised to help him out. I'm several $1,000s in debt from trying to pay his bills. A day before I moved him, he shattered his ankle when he stepped off the curb. Unable to work, we thought he would be okay with his family. They set up a tent in the backyard for him to sleep in, and after a couple months, kicked him off the property after his ankle healed. He's had 3 surgeries so far trying to repair his insides, but it seems like every time it just causes more issues. The last surgery was to repair 1 hernia, but the doctors just found at least 3. We are pretty demoralized, and he is tired of all the surgeries and never knowing if he'll ever be financially secure again. I am afraid I'm going to lose my father. Can't help him. I feel like a failure. Saved my life and he gets this. Meanwhile, George is still a free man. When I was younger, I had gone into my bedroom alone to change into my PJs, and my mom said I'd come back and asked her why Peter Pan was at my window and if I could let him in. She of course ran to my bedroom, and sure enough, someone had pulled the screen off my window and had opened it slightly. Needless to say, we moved shortly after that. I was oblivious to what was wrong, because, hey, I got to meet Peter Pan. TV shows and movies usually depict abductors driving white or black vans. I didn't realize this until I decided to buy a white 1994 Dodge cargo van to haul some of the gear I needed for work. While driving it, I've been pulled over by cops and searched 3 times for no reason, but that is another story. The point is, some people see vans as suspicious. One day, while returning home, a woman pushing a stroller stared at me for a long time while I drove along my home street. We have speed bumps and I have a lot of expensive, delicate gear in the van, so I was driving very slow. She stared at me, wide-eyed, the entire time, so I smiled at her like a friendly neighbor does. staring so intently she almost walked the stroller right off the edge of the curb. I thought it was funny and almost forgot about it. A week later, our HOA email threads heat up when a resident sends out a notice that his wife and toddler were being stalked by a man in a white van. Fearing a pitchfork and torch mob mistaking me for a creeper, I replied to all saying I live in the neighborhood and also drive a white van. I even provided my license plate number and home address. Big mistake. Jokingly, I added that I also witnessed a suspicious person in the neighborhood, a woman with a stroller who was staring at me so long and hard it made me uncomfortable. I provided a dated time of the incident to see if the alleged stalker was actually me. It was. Dude got triggered, started sending me email after email, CCing everyone on the list, telling me he can read between the lines of what I was saying. His accusations became more and more ludicrous and turned into personal attacks. The emails eventually stopped, but things got even weirder. On several occasions while walking my dog, a 10-ish-year-old girl would come out of her house, run over to me, awkwardly chat me up about my dog. I wondered why this child was talking to strangers, but thought maybe she just knew me from the neighborhood, so I politely played along. Then one day the girl shows up at my house. She said she was angry because her dad wouldn't let her have a dog like mine, so she wanted to visit my dog for a while. I told her I needed to talk to her parents before I could let her visit my home like this. She said okay and left, and I never saw her anymore. I have 2 daughters, and one of her friends told me that the girl who was chatting me up is the daughter of the triggered dude from the HOA email list. He had been sending her out to talk to me and take pictures. My daughter's friends was friends with his bait girl. Poor girl's dad is making his own daughter uncomfortable, which is why she confided in her friends. The dad was sending his daughter out to chat with me so he could accuse me of I do not know what. One detail I forgot to mention. I have dash cams in all my vehicles and a CCTV monitoring my front door. So the initial incident with the wife, as well as the girl coming to my door, was recorded. I emailed the triggered dude and kindly offered him copies of the videos for each incident. I also told him I was concerned that his daughter was behaving inappropriately towards strangers. Apparently this scuttled his plan. I never heard from him again. I'm currently starting to fear for my coworker's life. Here's the story. My coworker, I will call her Jane, is 33 years old, a virgin, and a very devout Christian. Her family is very strict and religious. I'm not bashing on religion in any way. I was raised a Christian myself. These people, though, they just seem to take their beliefs to the next extreme. Think of them as Flanders from The Simpsons. I mentioned Jane is a virgin because she honestly never had a boyfriend before. She's been on a few dating websites as of late, but she is usually very strict when it comes to the type of guys she would date. She can be kind of stuck up, which has gained her very little popularity. She recently meets a guy on OkCupid. Let's call him Miguel. Miguel claims to live in a bigger city than ours, an hour away. We live in the middle of nowhere in Kansas. And that he was 35 years old, also claims to be a virgin, and takes an interest in Jane. They chat for a while. She's very excited. Once they establish a fondness for each other, he claims he has $250,000 in savings and a job at Cessna that pays $65 an hour. He had a nice apartment and 2 cars, one of which being a '69 Dodge Charger. Sounds too good to be true, right? We all agree. Everyone but her. They agree to meet for the first date, and he says he'll drive down here to see her. While driving down here, he claims to get into an accident on the interstate and is left hospitalized. Jane is devastated. The rest of us, who she was telling this to, all assumed that he was just lying to her, and this was a way of getting out of the date, and her finding out that he was scum. We didn't think that there'd be any communication afterwards. We were wrong. They continued talking, and shortly after getting out of the hospital, he claimed to be hit by a car crossing the street. His life apparently took a turn for the worse, as he claimed he was laid off by Cessna. His apartment was burglarized, and all of his money and his other car was seized by the IRS due to a misunderstanding in his taxes from years back. Completely believable story, right? Jane decides she doesn't care about those things, and she's willing to continue talking to the man. He soon starts calling her daily and coming over once a week to visit her at work. At this point, we meet this guy, and he comes off as your typical loser with a beer belly who lays around the couch all day, yelling at his woman to bring him beer. Despite all the money he claims to have, he wears clothes that are way too big for him, usually sweatpants and flip-flops. This earned him the nickname Flip-Flops amongst us at work. He has problems making eye contact with people when he talks to them, and has the creepiest smile. We knew right away he doesn't seem very trustworthy. 3 weeks into their relationship, he shows up at our work and proposes to Jane. She gladly agrees. As we all shake our heads in disbelief, he tells us he got a new job working for Microsoft down in his city. We do the research. There is no Microsoft jobs over there, unless you're working and selling products at Best Buy. And he tells her he's now seeing a therapist for his anger and jealousy issues. Many red flags are going off in our heads at this point, but Jane doesn't seem to mind any of it. He moves down here to be with her after claiming his family disowned him for wanting to marry a Christian, and that's the reason why she'll never get to meet them. As if this isn't ridiculous or over the top enough, things start to get creepier from here. He tells us he got a new job for $25 an hour as the head engineer at Exide Manufacturing. The head of HR at Exide is actually a relative of a friend of ours, so we ask her about this. They never heard of this man, and the position he claims doesn't exist. We try to tell Jane about it, but she brushes off all of our comments and claims that we're just thinking too much about it, or we're just jealous. He starts picking her up and dropping her off at work every single day, as well as picking her up for lunches. She still believes he has a full-time job. He's only doing this because of how much he loves her. We start to feel like he's just wanting to know where she is at all times. He asked the maintenance man at our work after the first meeting to be the best man at their wedding. This doesn't strike Jane as odd, but apparently Miguel is untrusting enough for most people and has no friends of his own. Her parents loan him a spare van so he can use that to drive from now on. To our shock, her parents are already buying baby clothes and supplies for the couple. They are completely won over by this man. I think they're just blinded by the fact that their daughter finally found someone that would give them grandkids, which is a really sad thought. By this point, we notice her personality growing slightly more stressed and depressed as time goes on. Now, if you listened up to this point, you're probably thinking, oh, she's just another dumb girl who picked a sleazeball guy who's milking her for all she's worth. And you're definitely not wrong. We thought the same thing, until one day she dropped a little bomb on us. He recently told her they used to be special ops in the military, the Air Force to be exact, and they decided that they wanted him to work for them again. $75K for working 3 days, 3 weeks, 3 months. The story always changes. Something she doesn't find suspicious at all. Testing military equipment that's too dangerous that could be life-threatening. He agrees to the work, and we all think he's copping out of the relationship. She then tells us that if she wishes to remain in contact with him, they have to get married as soon as possible, and she would have to prepare to move away with him. She explains that the military has been calling her and making stops by the house to explain to her that she'll have to marry him immediately, and she has to be prepared to move to an undisclosed location at any given moment. From that location, she will not be allowed to make contact with friends or family, since all that's going on is top secret, and she has to prove that she can be trusted. Obviously, all of us are now alarmed. Everyone but her and her family. They are delighted that she's with a military man and are proud that she gets to be a part of something much bigger. The rest of us, sane people, are trying to figure out what on earth he could be plotting. Is she going to be hijacked into human trafficking? Is he going to murder her? One of our coworkers had just called the human trafficking hotline, and they think that this is something they definitely have seen before. Unfortunately, they can't do anything about it until he actually makes a move and takes her. We're looking into contacting our local police to see if there's anything that can be done about this, before she gets the phone call that tells her that they have to make their move. This is all so crazy. We don't know what to expect or what danger she really is in.